Hello, hello, hello.
Hello! Hello, humans. You're listening to The Great Everything.
The Great Everything.
An exploration into the stuff that makes us human. To the ideas, stories, and culture that make humanity great. You're listening to The Great Everything. A conversation about becoming a better human.
Hello! I am calling in response to your segment here, and so much of what you just said resonates with me.
Doesn't it feel sometimes like life is a treadmill that's kind of going too fast, running away from us?
Brilliant thought process as usual.
I don't really have very optimistic views of the world, but I like listening to your station.
But the thing about treadmills is, although you're struggling to catch up, you're always staying still. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. This is The Great Everything, an exploration into the stuff that makes us human. And I'm Patrick, a former banking lawyer who saw the light and quit to dedicate my life to culture and philosophy. So I like to say that this show is about becoming a better human and exploring how we can do that to live in greater harmony with ourselves, with the people around us, and with the world generally. But becoming a better human is a kind of vague concept, isn't it? You've got an idea of a directionality there, better, but what does it mean to become a better human? What ethical systems can help us do that? Deontology, for instance, that's most often associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and it's the idea that in order to be good, you have to live and abide by certain rules. And there's a big question as to what those rules should be. Kant had his categorical imperatives, but if you're a Christian, that's the Bible. If you're a Muslim, it would be the Quran and the Hadith, etc., etc., etc. The point is, there are rules and you just have to stick to them in deontology. Or perhaps consequentialism could help us out. The idea that the moral value of an action is determined by the consequences of that action. But if that's the case, how do we know which consequences are good or ethically desirable beforehand? Or maybe it's virtue ethics, the notion that consequences, rules don't really matter. It's all about inherent character, so to be virtuous you just need to work on your own character. But if that's the case, then which qualities, which characteristics count as virtuous? How do we figure that out? As you can hear, as soon as you start thinking about morality, one issue really jumps out at you, and that is that it's so difficult to determine what right and wrong are. How do we agree on that? How do we understand right and wrong? If two different sets of moral beliefs are in contrast with one another, and we see this all the time in religion and politics, for instance, who decides which should prevail? Who gets to decide that? The fact is, because we live in a society, we have to make choices about what that society should look like, how we want it to be run. So there are important questions that we need to determine and hopefully even agree on. And if, for instance, we can agree that, okay, maybe we can just put different sets of rules for different people, how do we decide who each set of rules should apply to? You can see the problem here. We've got hundreds of different cultures in the world, and within those cultures we've got millions of individual points of view. How likely does it seem to you that we could all, and I mean all of us, agree on fundamental philosophical issues like right and wrong, when within our own countries we can't even agree on things like the death penalty or abortion or eating pork or cow or any meat for that matter? Could there ever be such a thing like a universal ethics, a set of rules that we say, okay, this applies to everyone, this is what good is, this is what bad is, as we understand those things today? You might say, no, of course not. This is just a rhetorical question. But it's not really rhetorical. Because what if, instead of rules that apply to everyone, we could at least agree on some broad principles that give us a general idea of the direction we should head in as a species? And if we could, then what would those principles be? And when we're talking about morality, we do tend to make it about how we want the world to be run. It's usually about politics, these grand principles that unite us. But actually, we need ethics on a small scale every day in the little choices that we make in the moment. Right now, do I eat the thing I really want to eat, or do I stick to my diet? I'm really, really tired. Do I give up my train seat to this lady? Should I tell my friend her girlfriend might be cheating on her? Can there be rules for all of this, or any of this? Or maybe should we just all go on our own gut intuition, do what you feel is right in the moment? Okay, but then how do we know that our intuition is right if you and I have different gut feelings? How do we even know that the feeling I'm getting is my genuine gut, or if it's some kind of rationalization? Sometimes mind and gut really do get mixed up. It's like in the cartoons with the angel and the devil on your shoulder, except with gut and mind that sometimes they're very hard to tell apart. You see, with morality, there's just so many questions. While we're at it, let's ask some more questions. Which should we follow more in morality, our instinct or our reason? And if one over the other, why? And if it's a bit of both, how do we know when to pick which? And how do we balance them? And what if there's a conflict of moral commitments, telling the truth versus keeping the peace in a situation, or protecting a guilty friend versus seeing justice be done? Which of these commitments should take precedence? What's the point of morality? Is it about God? And what if you don't believe in a God? Could morality just be evolution, slowly giving us the morality that has best equipped us to survive? Except evolution, it's not just responsible for the best in us, it's also responsible for all the bad stuff. Natural selection favored those who were good at doing war, for instance, and favored our tribalism. So who says that evolution is necessarily a good argument just in itself? Could we bypass our biological evolution and decide to rewire some of our evolutionary instincts that might no longer be useful today? And how do we do that? And if we can, what for? What's the point of that? Is the point of everything just our thriving as a species? And who even says that that's a good thing? You might have heard my episode on antinatalism. What if the morally correct thing for us to do is to just die out, because without us there would no longer be any suffering in the world? You see, it's just questions all the way down. And that's sometimes frustrating, because the more you search for answers, all you find is questions. And there's all these open threads going in thousands of different directions, and when you follow one thread you just keep getting to more and more bifurcations. And which thread do you follow? And it's so rare that you can ever reach the end of one thread and tie that up into a nice little ribbon and work your way back and know that you're on firm ground. Maybe instead of trying to answer any of these questions in a way that can apply to everyone in any situation imaginable, which really does seem to be a fool's errand, maybe all we can do is be less ambitious and just reason our way through our own behaviors and moral intuitions, and rigorously of course, so that we might not know what it means to be good or bad, but at least we can understand better what we think is good and bad and why we feel that way, so we know that in the moment we've made genuinely the best decisions that were available to us and to our understanding at the time. Basically, no answers today, just a ton of questions.
Patrick, I am humbled.
Patrick, why you blowing my mind, man?
I wanted to say to you how much I've enjoyed the segments on your station today.
You're always so busy creating all of this amazingness.
Jeez, your show is just so stupid good.
Honestly, the content that you produce here is truly life-enriching.
Patrick, hello. I was listening to you talking about shrimps.
No one's communicating these ideas like you are. No one. No one anywhere.
Patrick, I actually agree with you about emotions. I would say that emotions are clues to what might be true about reality.
You're blowing my mind today. Killing me.
Patrick, you have no idea how refreshing it was for me to hear you share the advice that you shared with me in the segments that you did and the way you did.
Anyway, I just really wanted to thank you.
Thanks for always being there.
Thank you for all you do on The Great Everything, and I'm always looking forward to hearing more.
Patrick, when I grow up, I want to be just like you.
A part of me really does think that whether we think it's possible or not, we do need some kind of universal ethic. Not rules, but at least some broad principles, some guidelines. We might want to call them universal directives, where we know that as long as someone is acting broadly in line with those directives, we are dealing with an action that is, at least in some sense, ethically acceptable. But of course, logically, it doesn't seem likely that we could ever agree on what such a universal ethic would be, because we're so different. We can't even agree on whether La La Land is a good movie. I mean, no, it's not. But what if there are things out there that we can agree on? And if we could do that, should we? I think so. Because What we have now, well, it's certainly not universal. It's all different beliefs about right and wrong, depending on our background, depending on what we read, depending on who we hang out with, who we listen to. This is true at an individual level. Every one of us has slightly different ideas. It's kind of like an ethical Tower of Babel. Then, of course, based on our individual worldviews, we find people whose ethical beliefs and behaviors most align with our own, and that's who we decide to hang out with. And then evolution gets to work, and it favors groups whose ethics are most useful. Those groups that have the values that are best placed to ensure their survival and thriving, those groups will outbreed or outcompete those other groups, and so they will also breed out the views of those other groups, which means that now we've reached a place where we've narrowed down the divergences into a few broad categories. But does this description satisfy you morally? I feel that it's lacking something. Because even if it might be a fairly accurate description of the way things are, moral ideas being subject to evolution, natural selection gets to work on them, and only the useful ones stick around, does it mean that it should be that way, or that it has to be that way? One way of looking at it would be to say, sure, if that's the way it is, that's natural by default, and we just have to accept it and make the best of it. And maybe to truly be in harmony with the world, which is, the grand Taoist ethical principle, but also Dharma in Hinduism, we need to accept that we can never really agree on right and wrong, and that's just the way it is, and that's part of the world we live in with all its marvelous multifaceted variety. Except, I just can't get over the fact that we are in such a unique stage in our lifespan as a species. Bret Weinstein, he's a pretty interesting evolutionary biologist. He says that we are at a unique point in evolution because of culture. We all know, broadly speaking, how evolution works. We have a set of genes, and within those genes there are mutations, and these mutations are entirely random. And because it had a long neck, it could reach higher up and access food that the little half-necked giraffe couldn't reach, which meant that the half-necked giraffe died out and the long-necked giraffe survived. Now that's obviously, evolution for dummies, including myself, because I'm a dummy when it comes to biology. But the point is, it's random. The proto-giraffe didn't evolve to have a longer neck because the leaves on the branches were high up and so it could reach them easier. The proto-giraffe randomly evolved in various directions. One of them evolved to have a shorter neck, one of them had an extra toenail, another one just had a bigger dick, and one of them had a longer neck. And what happened is that guy with the longer neck, that guy could reach the highest leaves, which meant that it could eat more, which meant that it could breed, and therefore its kids had longer necks because those were the genes that it passed on. And the guy with the shorter neck, well, he couldn't reach the leaves, so he died out after a few generations. So the mutation, though, was random. There was no mutation that said, I need to reach the higher leaves. Mutation just happened. The one with the shorter neck died, the one with the longer neck survived, and the one with the big dick likely also survived. It's probably a horse now. If evolution really can be mapped onto culture as well as on biology, then ideas are like genes, what Richard Dawkins calls memes. And new ideas about morality are like the mutations in evolution. Except unlike the mutations in evolution, these mutations aren't random. Through language, we have gained the ability to discuss ideas with each other, where we want to go as a species, which direction we want to grow in. In other words, we can test things out before natural selection gets to work and decides what works and what doesn't. Which means that we can get to do something no other animal can. Decide the mutations that determine our evolution. Some ideas we try work, if they give that culture what it needs to survive and then keep on that forward momentum. Some ideas we try simply don't work. The Dobu tribe. Sam Harris talks about them in The Moral Landscape, I think it is. It's a very small tribe, they're almost extinct, who have a preponderant belief and a whole system of values that revolves around hostile black magic. So whatever happens to you, it is caused by some neighbor who has thrown a curse on you. And if you are lucky in any way, say your crops grow or you have healthy children, it is because you have done some black magic against someone else, because they see the world as a zero-sum game. Any gain to yourself is a loss to someone else that you have caused through hostile black magic. So everyone hates everyone else, everyone's distrustful of everyone else, and worse still, people are most distrustful of those close to them, their family and their neighbors, because in their system of beliefs, the closer you are to someone, the more effective your black magic is. Now, needless to say, this is not a set of values that has the ability to scale and become mainstream. This is simply not a path to a healthy, prosperous existence, right? It's a miracle this small tribe could survive this long. Other ideas we try, they work, because maybe they give that culture what it needs to survive, and so it sticks. And if that idea sticks around for long enough, maybe it even becomes hardwired, indistinguishable from instinct. That might be, for instance, our instinct for fairness. A natural preference for fairness is something that we see in toddlers. This is something you can read about in Paul Bloom's book, Just Babies, on the origins of good and evil. Now, if toddlers have that instinct, but animals in the wild don't, I mean, you look at any Nat Geo documentary and it's very clear that nature is not fair. Yet we have that instinct for fairness. Clearly, we have descended from hominids who understood that through fairness, they could actually create better and more stable chimp tribes and then societies. So those instincts became hardwired. But now, with culture, for the first time ever on this planet, we get to try out new paths for evolution intentionally. That's, for instance, how we got our modern liberal democracies, with all their flaws, but also their virtues, by testing ideas out. A whole lot of intentional, consciously thought out, planned ways of governing a society. Think of all the failed revolutions throughout history. These are all human attempts at coursing a new path, deciding evolution through culture. So, shouldn't we think about ways to help us thrive and have the most well-being, not just for ourselves, but for other conscious beings we are in contact with? We've been at the top of the food chain for so long, we assume that we're here to stay, but the truth is, 99.999999999 infinite percent of living beings that have ever existed no longer exist. We won't exist forever. At some point, we are going to die as a species. And really, there's no reason our end has to be in millions or thousands or even hundreds of years. So how about thinking about ways for us to stand a better chance? And knowing what we know about the threats we face, shouldn't we be using this amazing evolutionary advantage to think about what morality actively would promote our thriving as a species? Now, at this point, you might come in with the antinatalist argument and say, you know what, it's better for all of us to just slowly die out. All the pleasure and well-being in the world can never outweigh the suffering, and the most important thing is that there be no suffering. But I don't agree with this. As I mentioned in the episode on antinatalism, I prefer to hope for the presence of well-being more than the absence of suffering. So my personal vision of what is good is a vision where all conscious beings are in an active state of well-being, not just one where there is no suffering, because nobody exists to suffer. This is like that famous saying about the ancient Romans, they turn the world into a graveyard and call it peace. But that's just my personal viewpoint. I believe in good more than I fear evil. So maybe this is where I personally have to plant a flag. Okay, maybe on some godlike view of the universe there is some great argument for our dying out as a species, but here I have to take a leap of faith and say, no, this is something I choose to believe in. And that is, if good is to mean anything at all, then it has to mean the greatest well-being for all conscious creatures. So once I've done this, maybe a logical gut instinct move, I feel we've got a solid grounding to be able to build a set of guidelines so that we know we're moving in that direction, or at least not sliding backwards. And that's what I think this universal ethic would be needed for us to be able to collectively decide what is good and bad for us as a species, and what behaviors to reward and what behaviors to punish in a path towards a better future for everyone.
dig it?
Reef from Medicine Remix, obviously a huge fan of the show.
Can you dig it?
Please, please, please go ahead and do that. That series.
Can you dig it?
So all that said, the question, I guess, is how do we build this better culture, this new evolution of ethics that can hopefully project us into a brighter tomorrow? What are the moral principles that we should come up with or preserve in order to be able to survive and hopefully even thrive as a human species? I'd like to know your take on this. What are your moral beliefs, the ones that aren't just personally valuable to you, but that you genuinely believe should be universalized so that they make their way into this new global ethic? What are those ethical principles that matter so much to you that would make the world a better place? Now, you probably know what my views on this are. I don't really like rules because I find them too prescriptive, I find them too rigid, right? They're not well equipped to be able to deal with the infinite complexity and variety of the human experience. Instead, I prefer to talk about broad, flexible principles that can adapt and be made applicable to any situation that arises. And if I'm coming at this problem through the lens of our survival as a species, then of course we need to think about the threats that we face. Things like war, disease, shortages, climate change, artificial intelligence, just to name a few. These are all threats that are potentially, and I'd say likely, existential. Which means that they're not just threats to one group of humans or another, but to humanity as a whole. And I suppose it's pretty universal wisdom, but also, science, that when things come together and unite under a common purpose, it makes those things stronger. It's the classic united we stand, divided we fall principle. And in order to deal with problems that we're facing as a species, we need to come together as a species first. So in my view, any universal ethic would have to be first and foremost about identifying and finding those aspects that we all can agree on, those aspects that we share, those core ideas that are really all about our common humanity. What is it that we truly can say we all share? And we can talk about that till the cows come home. We can say that we all want to be loved, and we want to feel healthy, and we want to feel well fed, and we don't want to feel unloved or unhealthy or wanting in any way. That's a start. But ultimately, the whole point is our common humanity. And so if I'm thinking about ways to enhance and strengthen our bond of common and shared humanity, my own attitudes and tendencies bring me to focus on the big obstacle to us coming together as a human species. And that, of course, is tribalism. We need less tribalism. I've talked about this not just once or twice, I talk about it constantly. I can't stand tribalism. And I understand that it is an evolved instinct and that at some point in our remote past it served a very useful purpose, and at the time it did enable and help our survival. Yet at this point in our lifespan it has clearly become a bug, not a feature of us as human beings. We must get over our tribalism. And we have reached a point in our civilization where the levels of tribalism and polarization have become preposterous. Politically, it's all around us. Look at what's happening in the United States. People falling out with each other over who they voted for. People driving cars into crowds over protest rallies. Students setting fire to trash cans because some conservative speaker was going to turn up. The level of outrage and anger and just sheer us versus them mentality, the impossibility of airing different opinions that deviate from the mainstream views on big topics such as racism or sexism or any kind of ism. These are levels of tribalism and polarization that are just appalling and that do us no good. And it's not just in America, obviously. And it's also, sadly, not just about politics. Think about the ruckus, the level of bile and vitriol that was flung across the internet when the Ghostbusters movie came out. And fine, you might say that there was a political element involved there with the whole sexism debate, but go on any forum or on YouTube, you'll hear just hatred, these camps and factions that are formed over things like whether or not you enjoyed Batman vs Superman, whether you were hoping it was going to fail or not. It's just pure team mentality. Absolutely unhelpful. It is creating greater gaps between us instead of bridging those gaps. We definitely need less tribalism, less polarization. But I understand that making a negative case against tribalism is easy because it's not really a positive case for anything else. So what positive value should we cultivate in order for us to somehow contrast this rising tribalism and polarization? You might say love, that's a very hippie-ish sort of answer. All you need is love, really. And I guess it's true, but the fact is, it's very difficult to construct a workable ethic around love. I, as much as anyone else, try to live by Jesus Christ's suggestion that I should love my neighbor. But the fact is, my neighbor's 6-month-old child wakes me up at 3 a.m. every night by crying his head off, and his bedroom shares a wall with my bedroom. So, as much as I'd want to love my neighbor, I fucking hate her kid. What I'm saying is we're human. It's not easy for most of us to be able to tap into some kind of universal love for every living creature. So what instead can we do that would work as a broad prescription to contrast tribalism? I think the answer to that is dialogue. We have to instill ourselves, each other, and everyone around us with this idea and principle that should really be held as one of the highest principles we could ever adhere to: the value of dialogue. I personally believe dialogue can solve almost any problem in the world, except maybe cancer. And it certainly can help resolve issues relating to polarization and tribalism. We all live in our little subjective universe. It's our own personal point of view that nobody, not even our closest loved ones, can truly, fully share. Through language, we construct a bridge that crosses that gap, that space between you and I. Through language, we translate the images and the feelings inside our head into words, and those words travel across that void and reach someone else's ears, and those words then get retranslated into other images and feelings in the other person's head. It's imperfect, because you can never fully convey your own feelings into words, and whatever comes out of your mouth is going to be an imperfect rendition of what's actually in your head. And of course, the way that's heard is going to be filtered through your interlocutor's own preconceptions and biases and upbringing and all the other factors that get in the way of them hearing you clearly. But the fact that it's imperfect doesn't make it any less miraculous that we have a means of communicating what is in our head to another living being. It's a blessing that we have to take advantage of. If this is about building bridges that can strengthen our understanding and our belief in our common humanity, where should we focus our efforts, if not towards entering into dialogue with those we most disagree with? It's easy to sit down and converse with people you agree with and you like and whose ideas you find fascinating. It's much harder to do it with people you profoundly disagree with, but that's where it's worth making the effort, because bridges are most needed where there's a gap. This effort of communication, of dialogue, really requires at least two things that I can think of. One, a sincere and rational effort to most accurately convey in words what you are thinking and feeling. So real attention has to be made to how you express what's inside you in a way that minimizes the potential for misunderstanding. And where there is misunderstanding, you have to be willing and open to accepting challenges and answer honestly to clear up any discrepancy between what you thought you said and what was heard. But there's the flip side to that. We need to properly listen more. And listening is not something that we do. And I myself am extraordinarily guilty of this attitude. Most of the time, we're not listening to actually hear what someone else is thinking and feeling. We're listening with the sole objective of knowing what to answer to. You're not really hearing what a person wants to say. You're just listening for certain keywords that you can latch onto with your own response and repartee. That's not listening. That's just waiting to talk. And there's also a more pernicious aspect, and that is the fact that very often when we disagree with someone, we are filtering what they're saying through our idea of what we think they're saying. In other words, when we disagree with people, we characterize them in a certain way. Either we believe they're wrong, or we believe they're evil, or we believe they're mistaken in some other way. But the point is, we have cast them in a certain role within our mind. So what we're really listening for is for them to do or say something that confirms our preconceived notion of who they are and what they are actually saying. Which means that if 1% of what they're saying is something we disagree on, that 1% is really what we're going to focus our attention on and disregard the rest, no matter how agreeable we find it and no matter how differently it shines a light on that 1% we disagree on. In other words, maybe where they're coming from is someplace that we would agree with entirely, but because we've already miscast them in our own minds, that 1% is what's going to jump out at us and cancel all the rest, so that in our minds we know that we are right in casting them in whatever role we did. We need to stop doing that. We need to listen more openly. How do we do that? Well, ultimately, it comes down to you as an individual. But one thing we should avoid doing at all costs is jumping to conclusions about what other people mean. Just because we've heard other people say similar things and mean something we don't like, doesn't mean that the person we're talking to now also means those things, even if the words they used were similar or exactly the same. Listen to what they mean, not what they say. And if they say something you find unpalatable, give them the benefit of doubt, ask for an explanation, and then listen to their response. One of two things can happen. Either they confirm that your understanding was correct and they really did say something unpalatable or offensive or just that you disagreed with profoundly, or they can say, no, sorry, that's not what I meant, this is what I actually mean. And in this second case, well, here's where you have to pay attention to your own response, because here something really interesting usually happens. And this kind of brings me full circle to the initial question in this episode, is how do we know we're doing the right thing? I think ultimately we rarely do, but we can have guidance. And as underwhelming as this may sound, I think our most accurate guidance is listening to our own conscience. And I don't mean this in an airy-fairy kind way. I simply mean that when we are making a choice, when we are acting in any way, deep down, if we're being honest with ourselves, we know where that action, where that choice, where that utterance is coming from. Is it coming from a positive place or a negative place? And we know the difference in how that feels. We know how it feels when we say, fuck my diet, I'm going to eat the cake. We know how it feels when we say, I'm going to skip the gym today. We know how it feels when we're just looking for justifications for something that deep down we know is wrong, but we're just scrambling to find a rationalization for our bad choice. We know that feeling of, is it regret? Is it discomfort? We feel weaker. We don't feel as strong as we do when we genuinely know we're being good people. So always analyze yourself. Where am I coming from? When someone you disagree with, or maybe even hate, fucks up, what is your prevalent emotion? Is it joy because you believe some good will come from it? Or is there an undercurrent of pleasure because someone you dislike got his? When you see Richard Spencer get punched in the face on TV, what feeling is prevailing within you? Is it happiness and joy that punching a Nazi is going to make the world a better place, that this is an unqualified good? Or is your feeling mixed with a sense of revenge, of glee, of schadenfreude? There, he deserved that. Today I saw an article by Toby Young Toby Young is this guy who had to resign from the Office for Students in the UK because he's pretty much been attacked for being a neo-Nazi and a eugenicist. And the article indicated that this is just one of those classic Twitter outrages where he's been grossly misrepresented. He is nowhere close to the positions that he's being accused of holding. And the article was very convincing, like, guys, everything I did has been taken so grossly out of context that it's impossible that the people who took them out of context didn't know what they were doing. And as I read this, I said, I'm going to have to retweet this because the level of intellectual dishonesty of his accusers is just breathtaking. And then I thought about it and I said, wait a second, I haven't done my independent research here. So I don't know if what Toby Young is saying is true or false. It seems that it's true. So I didn't retweet it. But the real reason I didn't retweet it is this. Because I wanted it to be true. I wanted Toby Young to be totally innocent and me be right about my beliefs about how crazy and evil the politically correct left has gone. Had evidence come out saying, no, Toby Young is actually just as bad as we say he is, and this is why, and had I been convinced by that, a part of me would have said, oh fuck, right, this doesn't further my narrative. And that's why I didn't retweet it, because my retweet would have come from a place of negativity, of hostility, of, yeah, let's show the world what fucking assholes these PC guys are, how evil they are. I wanted them to be enemies of reason. My retweet of Toby Young's post wouldn't have been motivated by a genuine, impartial desire for truth and justice, but by a vindictive and partisan, even tribal sense of outrage. And so I didn't do it. So that is my possibly underwhelming answer to the question of how do we do the right thing? We listen to ourselves. We might not know how to reach the best consequence. We might not even know what the best consequence is. But if we listen to where we are coming from and what feelings are motivating us, if they are pure or if they are tinged with negativity and hostility and petty vindictiveness, that should serve as good enough guidance as to whether what we're doing is right or wrong. And if that's what we do and we side with the nobler aspects of our nature, then even when we fuck up, we know that in the moment we made the choice, at least it seemed like the right thing. And in a world of difficult choices, that's not nothing. If that's what we're doing, we shouldn't be afraid to make mistakes. After all, the answer really is within us. It's just that sometimes it's the wrong one. Okay, break's over, and following my ramblings on morality, I received a number of call-ins and considerations that I'm going to share with you. So let's do that. Let's take some call-ins.
Hey Patrick, it's Reggie, your weekend watcher, and also a resident wet blanket. I'm going to push back against moral evolution a little bit. And before your listeners' jaws tighten too much, these are the grounds on which I'm pushing back. First off, evolution is only a metaphor, and for me, it's a metaphor that breaks down a little bit too quickly in the moral grounds. Like, it's a metaphor meaning, oh, we have to look how culture and morals and ethics change over time. And yes, time does progress as we conceive it. Or does it? But also, because we can't, there's no necessarily positive endpoint. We come to a lot of weird conclusions morally. The second way I'm going to push back against the moral evolution metaphor is if we accept that to be the way we're going to look at how morality changes over time, and we also accept that we can make changes to ethics over time, and they're sort of agreed upon between one another, then if we're forcing it in one direction or another, wouldn't that necessarily be moral eugenics? And in the process of eradicating the bad and promoting the good, wouldn't this cause us to find a little problem with who makes that decision? Is it a mob or is it an elite few? I don't know, man. That's just some thoughts. You do the thing.
Reggie, thanks for calling, and always a pleasure to hear from a wet blanket as you describe yourself. Because, guys, listen up, this actually applies to everyone. If you're challenging an idea, if you're pushing back in a way that is thoughtful and considered, well, that's exactly the kind of dialogue we should be striving for, right? That's the space where great things can happen. Because let's say you and me disagree on any topic. The worst thing that can happen is nothing at all, right? I hear your position, I disagree, and I don't change my mind. Nothing has changed. Then 1 degree away from that, you could say, okay, I still disagree with your position, but you've made me think about something that I hadn't considered, so I get to refine my point of view. I understand my own argument a bit better, so I've come out of that strengthened. So that's been positive for me. And of course, then there's the best case scenario, which is where you bring a whole angle, a point of view to light that I'd never thought before, and I've left it out, and my position was profoundly flawed, or maybe even entirely wrong. And that means that I get to change my mind. And that's the base case scenario, because that's my error correcting mechanism at work. That means that my previous worldview was not as aligned with reality as it should have been. So my interaction with you now, my changing my mind, has allowed me to recalibrate my worldview in a way that is more correct. I have profoundly improved because of this interaction, far more than I'd improve if I was right all along and maybe you just forced me to tweak my opinion, right? There's a bigger leap between wrong to more right than from right to a bit more right, don't you think? So this is what I'm looking for. Now, on to your point, I'm not sure where the analogy between evolution and morality breaks down, because you're saying that there's no positive endpoint to morality, but evolution doesn't have a positive endpoint either. It's random mutations, you know. Some things work, and so they stick around, and some doesn't. It's like throwing shit against the wall and seeing what sticks and what doesn't. And my whole point is that with morality, we can actually move away from the randomness aspect of evolution and decide which shit to throw at the wall, if we're going to stay within that analogy. And we can decide that based on intelligent assessments. So it's basically, you know, you're holding the shit in your hand and you're saying, this stuff doesn't seem good. Okay, let's discard that. Let's not waste time. Oh, this other shit, this one feels sticky. Hey, here, hold this. What do you say? Oh yeah, this shit is definitely going to stick real good. So they fling it and it sticks and you say, I knew it. Okay, pass on to the next shit. Okay, this is gross, but you get the point. We can actually decide. That's the whole point. Here we have the opportunity to bypass evolution and decide on an endpoint, or rather an end direction. Now I think you raise an interesting analogy here with moral eugenics, you know, deciding between good and bad morals. But I think the analogy might be confusing because the term eugenics, right, it's got very negative connotations, and I'm not sure we should attach those to the choice between good and bad ideas. Because, right, eugenics is also about enabling the survival of our human species, but historically it's just kind of always been associated with actual suffering, right? From the Spartans throwing their malformed babies off the cliff to the Nazis gassing the mentally disabled. So ultimately the problem with eugenics isn't the part that is about choosing between good and bad. It's that whatever's labeled as bad in eugenics is an actual person that will suffer or die as a result of that choice. With morality, the point of deciding between good and bad ideas is to create a society where we decrease the suffering of everyone in it, as well as future generations. So we create more equality, we create more well-being for everyone, and that's kind of the opposite of the practical effects of biological eugenics. In other words, I think the analogy between morality and eugenics breaks down as soon as you compare these two sentences. Let's eliminate bad ideas and let's eliminate weak people. It's not quite the same. And now as to who decides between which ideas to keep and which not, well, that's a great question, an excellent question. That's the question. And that's why I think the moral guidelines that we pick can't be rules, because we're going to disagree. Instead, I guess we have to just figure out the core values that unite us, you know, that constitute our common humanity, as I put it. Those aspects where we really can, all of us, agree. I guess the next question is, what are those core values? And that's the thing we need to figure out. I've got some ideas, but I'm sure someone will disagree. So, yeah, anyway, excellent points, excellent questions. And these are the kind of things we need to be thinking very, very hard about in order to build that new morality, hopefully.
Hi, Patrick. You were talking about tribalism, and I'm wondering if it's necessarily all bad. So if I put the interests of my immediate family above that of my extended family, and then my extended family's interests above that of friends, and so on, that's not necessarily wrong, because that total stranger, I don't know if that person has my interests at heart. It breaks down civilizationally, and maybe that just means that the way we've constructed civilization is wrong. It takes, according to scientists, 50,000 years for a genetic trait to leave a population, and we've only been civilized for 10,000 years, so we've got a long way to go before tribalism leaves our natural state of being. So we'll have to solve it soon.
Hello, Ron. So your question is whether I think that tribalism is necessarily all bad, and that would have to be a hard no. Because, first of all, I don't really think there's that much in the world that is necessarily all negative without any redeeming qualities. There's usually a flip side, right? And, of course, with tribalism, we're dealing with a trait that has been hardwired into us by evolution, meaning that at some point in our past, there must have been some useful and positive element to it. And of course we know what that element is. I mean, once upon a time we would have been very well advised to regard with suspicion any potentially hostile outsider. That's the kind of quality that might have kept us alive in the face of a potential threat. So there's a positive aspect of tribalism right there. And I think that the reason we see tribalism as inherently negative is just the term itself is so loaded. So maybe it's more helpful to look instead at the instinctual basis, or at least what I believe is the fundamental core instinct behind tribalism, and that is the more neutral preference for the familiar. So you know those experiments I keep talking about, the tests done on babies at Yale, where Paul Bloom and his team, he's a moral psychologist, he wrote an amazing book called Just Babies on this. They did a series of tests on babies from 3 months old to 18 months old to chart their moral development in order to ascertain which moral instincts we come into the world already possessing, which are hardwired into us, and which ones we develop through experience, through socialization, which ones we learn through just living. And on tribalism, or rather on our preference for the familiar, it appears that from the earliest age, from 3 months old, we already have this strong preference. So regardless of the baby's race, a baby will show a very strong preference towards people of the same race as the people that the baby is generally surrounded by. So if you grew up in a black household, at the very earliest age, if you see a black person who's not from your household, you will react more positively to them than to a white face. Curiously, this has more to do with language than with race, so the strongest positive reactions towards familiarity was towards people who read or spoke in the same accent as the other people the baby was already used to. So if a baby was coming from a English-speaking household, they would react more positively towards people with an English or American accent than towards people reading English in a French accent. So we have that strong sense of positive familiarity towards things that we recognize, which has the flip side, meaning that we are less positive about things we don't recognize. And that kind of answers your question, at least, I think, because you're talking about the positive aspects of tribalism being your commitment and bonds towards your tribe, right? Towards your family, towards your moral circle. And that is fundamentally good. That is a positive feeling of reciprocity, of collaboration, of love, even, towards the people within your quote-unquote tribe. The problem is, of course, when correspondingly you have more negative feelings towards people who are outside your tribe. And that's not necessarily something that has to happen, because I'm sure most of us as rational people are able to expand our moral circle to include people from outside our tribe, and that's something that we should be striving towards, to expand our ethical commitments to include people from the out group. So to answer your question, ultimately, the problem with tribalism isn't the creation of in-groups with all the positive bonds those entail. It's when we act in a positive way towards the in-group and correspondingly act in a hostile or negative way towards anyone in the outgroup. That is the negative aspect of tribalism that I think we should all be trying to curtail. And hopefully, through rational ethics, we might be able to do that. And finally, just a word on your point on 50,000 years being required to rid us of genetic traits. Fortunately, culture and language means that we can evolve far quickly than biology, which means that through discussing these ideas and coming to rational conclusions that are agreed upon by hopefully most of us, we can outbreed tribalism from our cultural DNA, so to speak. Of course, it's going to take a while, but it doesn't necessarily have to take 50,000 years. Think about how little time it took us to overcome slavery, and well, all things that we need to work on.
Hey Patrick, in terms of listening to other people, one of the habits that I have created for myself, which I've found to be particularly effective for me, and I'm pretty good at sticking to it in professional and more formal environments, arguably less so in just my day-to-day life, is when I am in potential conflict or have a difference of opinion with someone in the conversation, I will say, what I hear you saying is, that way, before I insert foot in mouth or go off on a tangent, triggered by something, I'm absolutely clear about what I heard, and they have an opportunity to confirm that that is indeed what they said, or to correct me on my misperception. I found that to be really helpful for me. It saves me from some unnecessary humiliation.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing that useful tip. I think it's a very valuable tool that we could all do with implementing more in our lives. Not least because it's so easy, right, to just add that little caveat whenever we respond. This is what I'm hearing. It's important. It's a recognition of that gap of subjectivity. It's recognizing the fact that what I hear might not be the same as what you said. And even if my hearing is on point, even if my hearing is accurate, so to speak, so that what I heard is exactly what you said, it's also recognizing that maybe the words you spoke might not be fully in line with what you meant to say. You might not have been fully aware of how those words would come across, how they would be interpreted. So that recognition signals that you are open-minded, that you are there not just to jump to the most negative conclusion about what they mean, but to genuinely understand their position. You're conceding them the benefit of the doubt. You're conceding chances there to be able to clarify the position. Basically, it's a recognition that conversation is very messy. It's so much going on there. There's bias, there's interpretations, there's filters, there's inaccurate, unclear speech. You're recognizing that conversation, dialogue is a messy process, but that you are willing to engage in that process in good faith and to help in the process of clearing up any mess that might emerge from that interaction. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and we should all learn from it. I tend to apply that even in arguments. So not just in debates about politics and abstract ideals, but in situations where I feel I've been wronged by someone in my life or someone did something I didn't like. I tend to always phrase it this way. Not you did this, not I accuse you of doing this, which just puts people on the defensive, but this is what it looked like to me. I'm not saying you were a dick. I'm saying that when you did this, this is what it felt like from this point of view. This is how I interpreted it. And that is basically giving you the benefit of the doubt, giving you a chance to say, oh, shit, that is not what I intended. That is not the impact that I intended to have. I was doing it because I thought that X, or maybe I did intend to have that impact on you, but I wanted to do that because I thought something that you had done was also unfair and unjust. Basically, sorry, I explained that terribly, but you get the gist. The point is that you are constantly recognizing the fact that there are two sides to a story and that you are willing to allow the subjective truth of each of us to emerge and then to discuss that openly and rationally with a view to, hopefully, conciliation. Great stuff, great stuff. Thanks, Mark.
Hey Patrick, it's Alan with Sentient Future. I've heard such great things about you and your station, and I thought it was about time that I reach out to you. Frankly, your conversation about tribalism today really resonated with me. I think you're spot on with identifying many of the problems that we face, and I like your attempt at some of the solutions. I too am trying to solve those problems. And since tribalism probably served some fundamental purpose in our evolutionary process, I don't see it going away anytime soon. But perhaps what we consider our tribe to be could. Sure, we have a bond with those close to us, our family, our friends. But perhaps our bonds and our responsibilities could first be to the community as a whole. I see the largest tribe we belong to is those that are sentient, those that feel pleasure and pain, namely humanity and most of the larger species. For those that feel that we have a moral responsibility to others, it makes little sense to have moral responsibility to beings that don't feel pleasure or pain, in the same way that it might not make sense to not have moral responsibility for those that do feel pleasure and pain. The beautiful part about sentiocentrism, rather than tribalism, is that even if our duties are to the community, our most effective behaviors are actually consistent with being self-centered. We achieve the most individually by working with others collectively, empathizing, finding shared goals, and achieving them together more efficiently with division of responsibilities and leveraging our respective strengths. This speaks to the united we stand, divided we fall mantra you mentioned, in addition to cooperative games in a game theory sense, where we really can create shared value and achieve what many call win-win solutions. Genetically and in a lot of other respects, we are just far more similar than we are different. Why we focus on our differences, I'll never know. And one of the more interesting parts of the sentient worldview that I've designed and propose is that it allows for mass customization. Namely, it works regardless of what your values are or what you value. It's simply a method in which to live according to what you do value, in a way that maximizes fulfillment and eliminates regret from your life.
Somewhere in there, I thought I heard you say that love couldn't be the answer, and you used a crying child next door to address that. I think the answer really is love, though.
Perhaps we hypothetically agree that universal love is the solution. It's tough, perhaps, to go from that concept to something practical and actionable. I came across a particular emotional model from Robert Plutchik. It's his wheel. Love largely can be looked at as the combination of 2 of the 8 core emotions, joy and trust. So if we can demonstrate that other people can trust us, and if we can focus on empathizing with them and bringing them joy, then how they feel about us could very well be described as love. Those are practical behaviors that I hope many of us can get behind.
Yeah, I'm a Christian, and yes, I hold to the Bible, but I try to apply agape, principled love. And principled love means you're doing the best thing for the other person, regardless of how difficult it is for you.
It worked for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He actually stated, "I have decided to stick with love because hate is too great a burden to bear." He knew that love was the only thing that could overcome the odds that were in front of him.
The podcast you just heard was recorded with Anchor. If you want to make your own, download the Android or iOS app completely free from anchor.fm/podcast. That's anchor.fm/podcast.